I have previously highlighted how the American Psychiatric Association managed to push the conversation surrounding psychiatry onto the question of the reliability of diagnosis and away from any questions surrounding the validity of diagnosis at a time when criticism of the mental health industry was at an all-time high. The APA in turn presented the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 3rd edition, published in 1980, as having solved the problem of reliability. Many key figures fell in line with this narrative at the time, but ultimately these claims did not stand up to scrutiny. The DSM-III did little to nothing to improve on reliability. Nevertheless, even in recent decades, it is this 3rd edition of the manual which has been presented as the vessel which saved psychiatry. And now I want to turn to the article, Psychiatry and the Presumption of Expertise, Flipping Coins in the Courtroom, by Bruce J. Ennis and Thomas R. Litwack. This is from California Law Review, 1974. While the article focuses on civil commitment, it provides a clear picture of the state of psychiatry of the 1960s and 1970s and why the mental health industry may have become so increasingly unpopular, including as it does a thorough review of the body of research available at the time. Although over 50 years old, I would argue that the article still proves relevant given that some of the issues its authors address persist to this day. For other issues, it is less clear, but given the aforementioned way in which the American Psychiatric Association tried to sweep the troubles of psychiatry under the rug with the development of the DSM-III, the article is a key read to understanding the not-so-ancient history of the mental health industry prior to the publication of this supposedly revolutionizing manual. Although I am not going to read the 60-page article in its absolute entirety, I did not want to skip over too much, and as such, I will be breaking this up into at least 3 or 4 parts. As Ennis and Litwack write, a critical aspect of the civil commitment process is the extraordinary influence psychiatrists exert in the determination of who shall be involuntarily hospitalized. At commitment hearings, psychiatrists are permitted and even encouraged to offer their opinions on the ultimate issues. Is the prospective patient mentally ill, or dangerous, or in need of care and treatment? Psychiatrists are also allowed to describe the potential patient using technical terminology and psychiatric diagnoses. Judges and juries, believing that psychiatrists are experts, usually defer their judgments and recommendations. In many states, persons who are not considered physically dangerous to themselves or others can be hospitalized involuntarily, even without judicial proceedings, if 2 psychiatrists certify that the prospective patient is mentally ill and in need of treatment. A person did not even have to be considered dangerous to themselves or others. They only had to be determined to be mentally ill in order to be physically imprisoned. And again, mental illnesses or disorders were and are claimed to be medical diseases, despite the lack of any biological tests or markers, even to this day. No state authorizes 2 laymen, a grocer and a clerk, for example, to hospitalize a neighbor simply because the layman believe he or she is mentally ill and in need of treatment. This extraordinary power is given to psychiatrists, but not to laymen, because legislators and judges assume that psychiatrists are uniquely qualified to determine when an individual requires hospitalization. This assumption of expertise rests upon 2 further assumptions: that psychiatrists are able to reach conclusions that are reliable, that is, that other psychiatrists would agree with those conclusions, and that those conclusions are valid, that is, that they accurately reflect reality. Unfortunately, judges and legislators are not aware of the enormous and relatively consistent body of professional literature questioning the reliability and validity of psychiatric evaluations and predictions. In this article, we examine the assumptions that psychiatrists are expert at resolving the issues relevant to a civil commitment proceeding, and that psychiatric opinions and terminology assist the judge or jury in reaching accurate and humane decisions. Based upon our reading of the professional literature, we have concluded that A. There is no evidence warranting the assumption that psychiatrists can accurately determine who is dangerous. B. There is little or no evidence that psychiatrists are more expert in making the predictions relevant to civil commitment than laymen. C. Expert judgments made by psychiatrists are not sufficiently reliable and valid to justify non-judicial hospitalization based on such judgments. D. The constitutional rights of individuals are seriously prejudiced by the admissibility of psychiatric terminology, diagnoses, and predictions, especially those of dangerous behavior, and therefore E. Courts should limit testimony by psychiatrists to descriptive statements and should exclude psychiatric diagnoses, judgments, and predictions. Part 1. The professional literature on the reliability and validity of psychiatric judgments. Before analyzing the professional literature, it is necessary to define a few terms and make a few observations. Reliability and validity are not synonyms. Rather, they are used in the professional literature as words of art and refer to quite different concepts. Reliability does not have a precise meaning, but as used herein, it refers to the probability or frequency of agreement when two or more independent observers answer the same question. For example, what is Mr. Smith's diagnosis? Is Smith dangerous? If representative pairs of psychiatrists interviewing a representative sample of prospective patients usually agree that each individual is or is not dangerous, the judgment of dangerousness is said to be reliable. Conversely, if pairs of psychiatrists would not usually agree whether such individuals are dangerous, that judgment is said to be unreliable. Validity, on the other hand, refers not to how likely psychiatrists are to agree about a particular judgment, but to how accurate their judgments are. If every psychiatrist in the world sees that Smith would commit a dangerous act if released from the hospital, that judgment would be 100% reliable. But if Smith were released and does not commit a dangerous act, the judgment would be invalid. Similarly, psychiatric judgments of dangerousness would be generally reliable if most observers would agree whether or not given individuals are dangerous, yet generally invalid if those judgments usually would be wrong. Even though the validity of psychiatric judgments is of primary importance, we are interested in their reliability as well, for psychiatric judgments are likely to be no more valid and probably less valid than they are reliable. For example, if predictions of dangerousness are 50% reliable, there is only one chance in two that a second psychiatrist would agree with the first that Smith is dangerous. If psychiatrists cannot generally agree whether Smith is dangerous, we cannot be confident about the accuracy of any individual prediction that Smith is dangerous. Smith is either dangerous or not dangerous, schizophrenic or not schizophrenic. When psychiatrists disagree, when their judgments are unreliable, it is evident that at least some of them are wrong. The more likely psychiatrists are to disagree, the greater is the likelihood that an individual judgment is invalid. The reliability of judgment also assumes major significance because reliability is usually easier to ascertain than validity. If validity studies are not available, examination of the reliability of psychiatric judgments provides a basis for estimating the upper limits of validity. If psychiatric predictions and opinions are no more valid than those of laymen, such conclusions should not be admissible. If similar conclusions by laymen would not be admissible, and certainly they should not be accorded any special weight. Special weight should be given only to the opinions of a witness who can demonstrate two things. A. That he uses techniques and knowledge not available to laymen to arrive at his conclusions, and B. That the application of these techniques result in judgments that are significantly more valid than the judgments laymen otherwise would reach. Before a psychiatrist's conclusory judgment can be considered an admissible expert judgment, much less worthy of special attention, the psychiatrist must employ techniques and apply knowledge that have been shown to produce substantially more reliable and valid results than could the techniques and knowledge available to laymen. It has been assumed that something in the education, training, experience, and techniques of psychiatrists makes their judgments more reliable and more valid than those judgments would be in the absence of such education, training, experience, and techniques. That assumption may be incorrect. There are many other assumptions surrounding the education, training, experience, and techniques of the psychiatrist or other mental health industry professional, with no realistic thought given to what can and cannot be taught or learned. But even if psychiatric judgments were somewhat more valid than those of laymen, we will argue that they should nevertheless be inadmissible in civil commitment hearings. Within constitutional limitations, only society can determine how valid a judgment must be, how certainly correct, in order to justify relying on it to deprive an individual of liberty. As we will demonstrate, the results of other scientific methods, such as polygraph examinations, provide far more valid judgments than those of psychiatrists, but generally have been excluded from the courtroom as insufficiently trustworthy to justify denial of important rights. Psychiatric judgments, though less valid, are generally admissible. This article questions whether such a policy is rational or constitutional. Section A. The reliability of psychiatric judgments. Theoretically, there are at least 4 kinds of psychiatric judgments that may be relevant in a civil commitment proceeding. Is the prospective patient mentally ill? Is he dangerous? Does his condition require or justify involuntary hospitalization and treatment? Will involuntary hospitalization and treatment cure or benefit the prospective patient? There are several studies of the reliability of psychiatric diagnosis, and we will discuss those studies in a moment, but there are almost no studies of the reliability of psychiatric judgments in the remaining 3 areas. In other words, we do not know how often 2 or more psychiatrists would agree that a given person is dangerous, requires hospitalization, and will benefit from involuntary treatment. The consistency of opinions expressed on these issues, often of the utmost importance in a commitment hearing, is, as far as we have been able to determine, unstudied and unknown. And here the authors discuss the basic diagnostic terminology and broad diagnostic categories of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 2nd edition. The literature indicates that psychiatric diagnoses using these categories are not very reliable. According to Ziskin, the most common research findings indicate that, on the average, one cannot expect to find agreement in more than about 60% of cases between 2 psychiatrists. The chances of a second psychiatrist agreeing with the diagnosis of a first psychiatrist are barely better than 50-50. Or stated differently, there is about as much chance that a different expert would come to some different conclusion as there is that the other would agree. As a reminder to step outside the bounds of this article, many prominent psychiatrists claimed that the DSM-III, published in 1980, solved the issues of psychiatric reliability, with subsequent editions supposedly moving on to other issues. However, Kirk and Cutchins, in their article, The Myth of the Reliability of DSM, examined a rigorous study on the matter of reliability in terms of the kappa statistic, with 0 indicating chance levels of agreement, 1 perfect agreement, and 0.5 an agreement level halfway between. The study included interviews of 592 people, consisting of 390 psychiatric patients and 202 people from a non-psychiatric patient population that were conducted by highly trained and prepared staff at 7 different locations. Among the patient sample, the kappas ranged from 0.40 to 0.86 and had a weighted average kappa of 0.61. Among the non-patient community sample, the kappas ranged from 0.19 to 0.59 and averaged 0.37. Despite this study having been conducted in 1992, 12 years after the supposed revolutionization of psychiatry by the DSM-III, due to how it approached the problem of reliability, the numbers are quite comparable to those cited by Innes and Litwack in 1974. Actually, as we shall see, the reliability of psychiatric judgments of specific diagnostic categories, schizophrenia, paranoid type, depressive reaction, passive-aggressive personality, and so on, is even lower, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40%. Studies of reliability conducted under such controlled conditions produce higher rates of diagnostic reliability than are likely to be obtained in actual psychiatric practice. There, the lack of controls means that such factors as inexperienced or incompetent psychiatrists, particularized interviewing techniques and conditions, definitional ambiguities and biases, semantic differences, and so on all contribute to lower diagnostic reliability. In a lengthy review, Zubin surveyed the major studies of diagnostic reliability conducted before 1968. He concluded that the degree of overall agreement between different observers with regard to specific diagnoses is too low for individual diagnosis. The overall agreement on general categories of diagnosis, although somewhat higher, 64 to 84%, still leaves much to be desired. The evidence for low agreement across specific diagnostic categories is all the more surprising since, for the most part, the observers in any one study were usually quite similar in orientation, training, and background. Additional studies suggest that other types of diagnosis are also unreliable. In one experiment, 27 experienced psychiatrists, all members of a hospital faculty, used a standardized set of 565 statements to rate a patient presented to them in a half-hour filmed interview. The psychiatrists were unable to agree as to a patient's diagnosis, prognosis, psychodynamics, the causes of her problems, the feelings she was consciously experiencing, or the feelings that were latent, unconscious. The authors, noting massive disagreement, concluded that art far outweighs science when experts in the field of psychiatry try to say what they have discovered in another person. Practitioners of the art disagree with each much more than is commonly recognized. Psychiatrists seem to find sufficient strength and self-confidence in consensual validation deriving from what they assume to be and view as shared expert opinion. The men who are expert in the field would agree with my judgment. The findings reported here categorically contradict such a belief. In a study by Rickles and others, apparently non-psychotic patients were rated by psychiatrists on an 8-point scale of psychopathology. The reliability of psychopathology ratings among even experienced psychiatrists was found to be quite low, approaching 0. Nor are psychiatrists very adept at distinguishing between depressed and non-depressed patients. In 1959, a Philadelphia psychiatrist and leading depression researcher found himself disturbed by what he called the low reliability of psychiatric diagnoses of depression. As an experiment, he had 2 skilled psychiatrists diagnose a selected sample of 20 hospital patients. There was a somewhat embarrassing result. Both psychiatrists labeled 6 of the patients as depressed, but they did not choose the same 6. The preceding studies conclude that psychiatric judgments are not very reliable, but psychiatrists and judges act as if they were. Pasumanek and his colleagues, after citing other studies which indicate that psychiatric diagnosis is at present so unreliable as to merit very serious questions when classifying, treating, and studying patient behavior and outcome, report that despite the unreliability of diagnosis, the length of hospitalization and the types of treatment received are significantly different for patients with different diagnoses. In other words, differences in diagnosis are not merely semantic quibbles. Conceivably, patients with one diagnosis might be discharged or given only tranquilizing medication. Patients with a different diagnosis might be subjected to shock therapy. The conclusion that psychiatric diagnoses and even perceptions of behavioral symptoms are not very reliable calls into question whether psychiatric opinions are more reliable than those that laymen might reach. Unfortunately, but perhaps suggestively, we have discovered no such studies directly comparing the diagnostic reliability of psychiatrists with that of laymen. It is clear, however, that psychiatrists disagree frequently on broad diagnostic judgments. They disagree more often than not on more specific diagnoses, and important consequences flow from the introduction in a judicial setting of one or another of the possible but unreliable expert categorizations. When issues of such preeminent importance as the right to liberty are at stake, the available evidence surely does not justify the abrogation of the traditional safeguards afforded by our legal system and the subordination of constitutional rights to a well-meaning but contrary to fact belief in the reliability of psychiatric judgments. And I will stop here for now. Next time I will pick back up at Part 1, Section B, the validity of psychiatric judgments. I hope to see you there.